Welcome to APG Pathshala. Today we are going to discuss the module, the scope of moral philosophy, and this module is written by Shyam Ranganathan of York University. I am Raghuram Raju from University of Hyderabad. In this module, we shall explore the practice of philosophy as foundational to ethics. That is, there is a close relation between philosophy and ethics. Philosophy often provides justifications for ethics. Philosophy also gives a reflective account of ethical practices. Ethics is that application of philosophy that concerns with the questions of what should be the norm. There is a norm, and then why should that be a norm? What is good and the right way to explore this question? Namely, what is a norm? To establish the normativity of these concepts requires philosophical reasoning. Ethics is a mere extension of a philosophical project. So there are three important branches of ethics. One is normative ethics, the other one is meta-ethics, and the third one is applied ethics. Normative ethics deals with the norm. What is a norm which people should follow, and what is that which they should not follow. It sets the norm, and it is concerning about what is the consequences of following a norm, and what are the things that get generated, what kind of conduct gets generated if you follow this normative package. Now, the normativity is slightly different from customary morality. The difference between customary morality and normative morality is that customary morality is through practice. People have been practicing certain things. The justification for what they practice is not very important there. But in a normative ethics, the justification is very, very important thing. There is a lot of discussion about deliberating about a norm. Why should one norm be followed and why a norm should not be followed? For instance, you find in Plato, the concern is about what is justice. And you have, for instance, in Aristotle, the discussion about what is a good life, and particularly his discussion about the good of the soul. And then you have the deontological and categorical imperative in Kant, and then in utilitarians, you have a consequentialistic thesis. Okay, and utilitarians also come up with the maximum number, utility to maximum number of people, and then there is this contractarians who brought the whole lot of new concepts into the discussion. The equality in an unequal society is a concern which Marx highlighted. Then there is this huge problem of deriving ought from is, and then the social justice issue, the theory of justice became very famous with John Rawls. And the feminist came up with the gender justice or injustice. So all these things are normative aspects. Now, from India, you also have concern for norms. You have right in the beginning, during the time of Vedas, the concern for Rita. Rita is an order, a divine order, which is independent of human will. And then you have a slightly more diluted and a more descriptive aspect of a norm called dharma. Now you have dharma both in Indian philosophy, but dharma becomes very, very prominent and central in Buddhism. Now you have subsequently different kind of purusharthas, and then the most famous in Bhagavad Gita is Trigunas, and that Bhagavad Gita borrows from Sankhya, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Now one of the important normative exercise of Buddhism is, if Vedas and Upanishads are talking about universal self, how self has to be identified with Brahman, why is there caste? Why did their society accept hierarchy. If everything is Brahman, why is there hierarchy? That's a kind of a question he splashed on the orthodox Brahmanical or Buddhist or Hindu practices. So that becomes one of the important aspects. And the other important turn that comes to Indian philosophy is a shift from the individual salvation towards Sangha and Dharma. Now you have in Islam another important aspect that comes onto the table is the notion of brotherhood, the virtue of brotherhood. And then you have with the advent of modernity and the Western political philosophy, whole lot of important concepts like equality, justice, liberal ethical values have become very, very important within Indian philosophy. In addition to this normative ethics, you have metaethics. The metaethics deals with what is the nature of ethical statements. What is the nature of ethical statement? There is a background to it, namely with the advent of logical positivism, many disciplines had a serious consequences. Logical positivism found that the language had several terms which had no reference. There are terms which were ambiguous, not clear, and that went on. In other words, they found that language domain was larger than the factual domain. And they sought to eliminate the difference by trying to remove all those terms that had no reference. This they undertook through the principle of verification. They accepted only two kinds of statements: analytical statements, which are always true, the predicate is already contained in subject, and synthetic statements, which are either true or false. They are true when they correspond to reality, they are false when they do not correspond to reality. So if you accept analytical and synthetic statements only, then many statements do not meet this requirement. They fall outside philosophical domain of the positivistic brand. Now many disciplines get out, that includes ethics. So ethics proper, normative ethics, cannot be discussed under the purview of philosophy. So there are many people who came to the rescue of ethics, and then they said, look, it is true that norms cannot be validated through analytical or synthetic statements, but what we can do is we can examine what is the nature of ethical language. What is the nature of ethical language? Stevenson said that the nature of ethical language is expressing emotions, which is when I say X is good, it means you ask the question, for whom is X is good? It is to A, X is good. So A is more important than X is good, because it is for A that X is good. Okay. Then you have people who are prescriptivist, like R.M. Hare, who argue when I said X is good, I am only telling you that you also accept X is good. So they are imperativist. There are people who are descriptivist, who argue that the ethical statements describe the certain emotive aspects of it. So ethics under this category is not concerning about what is the right action and what is the wrong action, what is the right norm and what is not a right norm. What ethics is doing under metaethics is to examine and lay bare what is the nature of ethical language. In addition to normative and metaethics, you also have a third branch of philosophy, which is applied ethics. Applied ethics has taken this task of finding out how to apply the ethical norms in day-to-day life, particularly in the professional domain. For instance, applied ethics asks this question about, in its sub-branch called bioethics, why should I not commit suicide? If I own my body, I am an autonomous self, I should have a freedom to end my life. Why is this allowed and why is this not allowed? Now, there are several arguments in favor of suicide or against suicide. There are others who ask the questions about in this context, the other question that is asked is, what justifies euthanasia? Euthanasia is something where you have a consent to die. You don't commit suicide, you are not ending your life, but you have a terminal illness and you ask somebody's help, whether it is the doctor or the other people in the family, whose help is sought to terminate your life. Whether they should help you to see that you die. That's another important applied ethics that has become very, very prominent these days. The third one, which is of paramount interest in applied ethics, is abortion. Is it allowed for a woman to abort the fetus? Now, there's so much of work done on this, saying that if the fetus is a part of woman's body, then since she owns her body, she can get rid of the fetus. There are others who argue, no, the fetus is part of her body, but it is a living organism and it is capable of sustaining its life and growth after delivery. So it is a life already. So you have no right to kill life. It amounts to murder. So there's a lot of discussion about when does a fetus become a human being. Is it ever a human being as long as it is in the womb of the woman? So it's an endless debate about pro-life and things like that. So in addition to that, there is this legal ethics, which plays a very important role. Increasingly, all over the world, everything is going around the idea of ownership. Okay, so I write a book and somebody plagiarizes it. Okay, now should I go to the court and complain and then take that person for a task? And several things, plagiarism, to copyrights, several issues are coming into the open in the discussion. There is, let's take a small example, that I have a patent for one of my discovery, and if somebody infringes on that patent, I can take them to a task. But the question that is asked is it patented by you exclusively? Haven't many people contributed to what you have patented? There is a whole lot of knowledge system that you inherited, starting from using alphabetics to algebraic numbers and things like that. All these contribute to your discovery. It is your discovery, definitely, but you don't discover from nowhere. You discover using a lot of infrastructure which is in the public domain, that is put to use by you to arrive at it either directly or indirectly. The indirect supporters or facilities or resources contribute immensely to your discovery. So does it make to talk about my own discovery as if it is a discovery in isolation? So there's a huge lot of discussion that goes in the way of this. Various branches of study come under applied ethics. So there are standard presentation of ethics in leading textbooks. Now, for instance, let us take how somebody like Landau, Russ Schaeffer Landau, in his book Ethical Theory, covers what constitutes ethics. He has the following headings in this book. The first part 1, talks about the status of morality. Part 2, moral knowledge. Part 3 discusses why be moral. Part 4, what is the relation between ethics and religion? Part 5 discusses value. Part 6 discusses moral responsibility. Part 7 discusses moral standing. Part 8 consequentialism. 9 deontology. 10 contractarianism. 11 virtue ethics. 12 feminist ethics. And 13 prima facie duty and particularism. So look at the kind of a large canvas of ethics that gets covered, that constitutes one part of one selection of what constitutes ethics. Now let us in this context take up one problem that is gaining currency these days. Is ethics Western centric? If you open ethics books, most of the material comes from West, whether it is a Greek tradition or the Enlightenment or the continental tradition. Now you don't find the non-Western sources used extensively or in proportion to in some proportion in these works. So the question that is generally asked is ethics Western centric, or can we talk about ethics as a global discipline? Okay. Now this is an important question now, because we are increasingly becoming a global citizens. Now the lot of West is accessed by the non-West. Lot of non-West is getting participated in the West. So in this peculiar situation of the of moving from nation to the global, there is a need to factor and ask this question: is ethics Western or should it be global? Let us take a particular aspect to make the point about one, ethics being Western centric, and with how ethics ought to be global centric. Now, within a colonial context of Indian society, there are questions raised whether India has ethics in its thinking, in its contemplation, in its text. So the question can be split into two. One, Indians do not have ethics. The second aspect of this question is what we call ethics is not what they do. The answer to these two questions vary, but what is important to recognize is there is a lot of discussion about ethics in India or in other non-Western societies. For instance, you have a very unique case in Indian philosophy where bhakti is offered as one of the important ethical theory. For instance, as Patanjali of the Yoga Sutra argues, if we submit to the Lord, then we bring about our own lordliness. We are the practical outcome of our submission to the regulative ideal, the Lord. To this extent, we are free and perfect. Let us take this instance from Bhagavad Gita. And we can see, for instance, there is a possibility where we can interpret Arjuna as a consequentialist. How can we do it? Arjuna was reluctant to fight the war because of the consequences, namely that his kith and kin would be killed. His cousins will be killed. So why is he reluctant to fight the war? Because of the consequences. Okay. So you can see, for instance, a consequential streak in this stand of Arjuna. In contrast, if you look at Krishna, Krishna is saying that you should not bother about the consequences. What you should focus on is what is your dharma. Your dharma is to fight the war. You are a Kshatriya and the dharma of a Kshatriya is to fight the war. So don't bother about the consequences. Just stay with the idea of your duty. Okay, one can see, for instance, a remnant or a shade of deontology in this move of not taking the consequences into consideration but focusing on the action itself. So that is the reason why you can, for instance, look at both consequentialism and deontology in this act. Krishna also further argues that good things happen when people stick to their duty. So this is similar to that of, it's a mild version of bhakti ethics that we discussed earlier. There is also the very important notion of nishkama karma. Now, when we talk about nishkama karma, going outside this module, let's look at this in a different way. And one way to look at this in a different way is to bring in Gandhi's idea of non-violence. One of the remarkable things about Gandhi's interpretation of Gita lies in the fact that everybody before Gandhi interpreted Bhagavad Gita as a text that endorses violence. And Gita plays an important role in his life. So there is a problem. And what is the problem? The problem is that Gandhi is for non-violence and he accepts Bhagavad Gita, which played an important role in his life. But Bhagavad Gita endorses violence because Krishna tells Arjuna to fight war, and war generates violence. Now Gandhi comes up with a solution to overcome this contradiction in the following way. He's asked the question where he says that you should not read Bhagavad Gita as a text of violence. In fact, he argues that Bhagavad Gita endorses non-violence. He gives two important arguments. One, he asks this question, what is the context of Mahabharata? Mahabharata was narrated to the grandson of Arjuna, who was threatening to kill all the species, all the serpents, because he was, he had some issues with them. Okay? And Janamejaya tells the story of Mahabharata to show the futility of war, saying that this is what your forefathers have done and there was no winner and there are no loser. So don't fight, don't be violent. So that is a message which underlies the text. So this is the first argument that Gandhi gives to show that Bhagavad Gita, or in particular, and Mahabharata in general, do not propose violence. The other important point that Gandhi makes to show that Bhagavad Gita is a text of non-violence is he points out that there are three gunas in Bhagavad Gita. Three gunas that Bhagavad Gita uses extensively are actually derived from Sankhya. Three gunas are Sattva, Rajas and Tamas, and these three gunas are in a hierarchical order. They are, the Sattva is at the top, Rajas is in the middle and Tamas is at the bottom. According to Gandhi, Krishna finds Arjuna in the state of Tamas. So Krishna's endeavor is to move Arjuna from the state of Tamas to the state of Rajas, and maybe later move him from the state of Rajas to state of Sattva. So if you do not read the entire procedure and only take what is there in the text, you will be losing something which is very, very important. That's the point that Gandhi makes. The third important point Gandhi makes is, he says that most of the time, many people read Bhagavad Gita or Mahabharata as in a literal mode, but actually the text has to be seen in a metaphorical way, as suggesting that all that which is there in the text are there in each individual. Okay, and then we should become self-reflective and try to overcome these conflicts. That's an important thing that that is there in the text. So for instance, so if you open this kind of a discussion, you find that there are important ethical issues, ethical discussions, ethical norms that are available in non-Western societies, and some of them I just pointed out available in Hindu texts like the Bhagavad Gita. One could actually add more material, taking examples from Islam, taking examples from Confucianism, Taoism, and various other non-Western sources, so that ethics becomes not merely Western but global. Let's summarize this lesson. The scope of moral philosophy is wide and is bounded by philosophy, and philosophy can enrich the moral domain. And two important aspects of moral philosophy is universalism and generality. This backdrop allows us to see that philosophers in the Western and Indian traditions address questions of ethics. One thing that we discover when we frame the question of ethics philosophically is that philosophers the world over seems to about the range of options, but yet some differences remain. Thank you.